All right, everyone, what's good? Today I'm going to be going over perceptual filtering as the root of cognitive development. This is my own paper that I wrote, which explains construction of reality, which is a model of consciousness that I designed, that I created, and I wanted to introduce it to everyone on the internet. So I'm just going to go over my entire paper. We're going to go through it. I'm going to dissect it, explain what I mean when I say each of these things. Um, and then we're going to kind of go from there. All right. And that's just going to be it. So here we go. This is going to be fun. Okay. I think it's going to be fun. All right. It'll be fun. So, current models in developmental and cognitive science, while valuable in the addition of depth to psychology, reveal gaps in explaining how perception fundamentally shapes cognition. Okay. And part of the reason that I wanted to do this in this way is because I actually was hiding a lot of the depth. I didn't want to introduce construction of reality. I actually wanted to publish this article right away, but my professor at the time told me that that was not a good idea, and I decided that it was a good idea to just post it on the internet. So here I am. Okay, that's what we're doing. It's kind of crazy, I guess, thinking about it in hindsight, I suppose. Um, but the point is though is that I was actually hiding a lot of the depth that I have for construction of reality. So I also want to fill in some of the gaps there. Um, so all I mean by this is that the way that you perceive reality shapes the way that you think about reality. Okay. Um, and so, but in this paper specifically, I'm talking about like developmental psychology and cognitive psychology, specifically the categorization. That's what I'm talking about here. Um, and because it's true, right? They can't actually do that. A lot of these models they cannot unify multiple fields. They can't do it at all, really. And construction of reality actually does this. Um, the universal perceptual filter is an aspect of construction of reality, but it isn't really the entire thing. So we're going to kind of go through that as we read this paper together um, that I wrote. I'm a little tired, okay? And listen, it's a little late, but I wanted to record this video. I want to get it out there. I want to try to publish it tonight. So you just bear with me, okay? I'm a little sleepy. All right, let me just drink my water. All right, we're just gonna do this. I can't speak English apparently either. All right. Anyway, so this unifying these concepts, these fields, these two specific fields, may be achieved through contextualizing cognitive processes through the concept of a universal perceptual filter. In other words, a highest order category within which stimuli are processed. If applied properly to current models, the universal perceptual filter may adequately fill in the gaps that unify existing research under a new paradigm. Okay? This new paradigm, of course, would be construction of reality. And so this is part of the goal. The goal is actually to unify the entire field of psychology under a single paradigm, being construction of reality, which is this model of consciousness that I have created. And this, again, is the first paper towards construction of reality. This is the first official document um, that explains how construction of reality works, what it is, and what it means. And it's only 5 pages, mostly because I only had a couple months to write this. Again, I did initially want to publish this in a journal, and so I wanted to show a finished product to my professor to start working with her on like expanding the idea, but she told me to just wait. And so I didn't really take nicely to that because I wanted to keep working on it. Because if you had an idea that you thought could unify the entire field of psychology, you don't want to just sit around with it just waiting for something. I didn't want to do that. So that's why I'm here right now. Okay. Uh, Doing this. Okay. At the very least, she acknowledged that I was writing at a master's level. Um, and it did take me like about a month and a half to write this. So I definitely could have done it faster, but I had other things that I was working on at the time, and that's another thing. That's neither here nor there. Okay, I'm giving you backstory now. You don't need backstory. That's not what you're here for. I get it. I get it. I get it. Okay, just my bad. All right. Anyway, so the universal perceptual filter acts as a gate for sensory data. All stimuli must pass through this perceptual filter, which is necessary for a conscious interpretation of information. Now, this kind of actually leads me into what I want to talk about in the next paper that I'm going to write, which is actually going to be information processing, another aspect of cognitive psychology that I want to break down and fit under construction of reality. I can fit I kind of hint at multiple different subsectors of the field in this paper. I hint at cognitive distortions. I hint at information processing. I hint at, well, you'll see. We'll go through. You'll see everything that I hint at. Perceptual filters. Okay, you get it. You get it. Okay, but the point that I'm making here, okay, is just that we have a perceptual filter that exists at the top of a category, at the top of a hierarchy of categories, okay? And this category at the top filters every single thing that we experience, and it applies our interpretation of information through that filter. Okay? So if I had to like I don't really know. I don't have a whiteboard or anything. It would be nice if I had a whiteboard to explain this, but I don't. So instead, I'm going to use this deck of playing cards. Okay, so I'm gonna use a few cards. Okay, so let's say you have a category at the top of the hierarchy, and then you have a bunch of cards below the hierarchy. Okay, now you can imagine like a little table. Imagine a little table. Every single piece of information gets filtered through this category at the top. Okay, it must get filtered through this category. This category determines everything about you, your entire personality, who you are as an individual. Okay, and I explain more about how this works throughout the rest of the paper. But this has a lot of very large implications. And again, I'm very confident in the logical progression that explains this exact idea as a generative feedback loop. But we'll get into it, okay? So, this perceptual filter must then be unique to the individual and shaped in prior experience. All I mean by this is that this filter at the top is going to be unique to you, okay? And every single experience that you have ever had in your entire life will determine the construction of that universal perceptual filter, okay? So each experience contributes to the filter, which subsequently generates lower order categories. Okay, so by having an experience filtered through your perception, you create lower order categories. Okay, then the generative feedback loop creates lower order categories, which reinforce the structure and highest order category, right? So this is this generative feedback loop, right? So it generates the lower order categories, right? Which strengthens the highest order category, which creates more lower order categories, okay? So every single experience that you have gets filtered through, it gets filtered through, creates a lower order category, then comes back around and strengthens the initial perception. Okay? That's what I mean by this. And there's a lot of evidence for this. Again, throughout the whole thing, I explained there's a few different papers. And again, I plan on adding more as well. But I just think this idea in of itself is valuable enough to put out as it is in this paper. Okay? So experience refines each category through a verification system aligned with prior experiences and interpretations, reducing the likelihood of contradictory information, but simultaneously increasing the likelihood of error. So, what exactly I mean by this is that we have a hypothesis generation system, okay? And there's other models of consciousness that have proposed this idea. And I mentioned this if you're here from my social media video, from my TikTok or Instagram video, then you probably heard me mention that these ideas are going to contain other ideas, and because it's a unification of ideas, it's not a separation of ideas, it's not something that's trying to like overtake everything else. It's trying to unify the existing ideas that we have under a single paradigm. And I want to remind you of this, okay? Because in reality, there shouldn't be much contradicting the idea that I have, right? The more information that contradicts the idea that I have, the less effective it actually is, okay? Which is also why I'm putting it out on the internet. The more that people show me where it goes wrong and where it needs to be corrected in terms of the larger psychological picture, then um, I can learn from that and I can revise the theory, okay? But I do believe that the foundation that I have, this is mostly logically accurate. And again, this is why I'm putting it out there, because I want people to criticize it. I want people to say that's completely wrong, or, you know, damn, he's spitting facts, all right? Whatever it is, it doesn't really matter to me either way. I'm going to continue doing research as I see fit, and I plan on doing this with a scientific rigor that is appropriate of one doing research, okay? So that's neither here nor there, okay? Anyway, so what I'm talking about is the hypothesis generation system here, right? So as stimuli get filtered through, okay, they get filtered through this category, okay. The highest order category says, okay, where do we put it? Where do we put it, and why do we put it there? Okay, an example would be like, think about every time that you felt sad. Okay, think about every time that you felt sad. Now you have an experience, right, where you were sad when you experienced this thing. So you filter it through. Your highest order category says, hold on, what are other times that we felt sad? And then that experience gets categorized with the other experiences you had when you were sad. Okay? That's how that's going to work. And this is what I mean by this. All right? So conversely, categories shape the interpretations of stimuli, which is dependent on how prior experiences shaped the category in the first place. So this is when it starts to get confusing, because it goes back and forth, because this is a generative feedback loop. So we are literally going in circles in the explanation. So it's going to be a little confusing if you're not familiar with the terminology, okay? So we're gonna explain this again. So let's take the same example of, you have an experience where you're being sad, where you experience being sad, all right, and it gets filtered through. Okay, now let's say one of the experiences that you have in your existing category of being sad is actually you at an amusement park. Now, you were sad on the amusement park on this day because it started raining. Okay? This is a complete hypothetical. Okay? So it starts raining at the amusement park, and you're like, you wanted to go on this one ride, and you were really sad. So now that entire experience, that entire day ends up getting filtered, gets categorized as a sad experience. Now, okay, now you're like, oh, the rain makes me sad because I had this experience, right? So now every time it rains, you think about the time that it rained at the amusement park, and that makes you sad, okay? Um, so this is what I mean. The categories shape the interpretation, and the prior experience shapes the category. So it goes in a complete loop, okay? So it actually results in a generative feedback loop, okay? Also, that example is not entirely realistic, but that is how it works for the most part. If you're unfamiliar with the field of, I suppose if you're watching this, you would know that that's how it works. So I'm not too concerned about that, I suppose. Um, ay, ay, ay. Ay, ay, ay. Your childhood experiences shape who you are as an adult. This is not anything new. This is not like a crazy idea. All right. So that's just that's an example. It's a simple example, but it is an example of how that process would work. And this also explains that process under I think you get it. It explains it under the perception of construction of reality. Okay. Of the universal perceptual filter. Okay. So it is the foundation and the reinforcement of the system. Okay, so many well-established concepts within the fields of developmental and cognitive psychology are supported by this idea, and the following discusses the research that leads to this theoretical understanding. Okay, so all I mean by that is just that I read a few papers and I tied it together with my theory. All right, and I'm going to continue to do that. All right, that's all I meant by that. Okay, so this is one of my references, right? Dang and Slowski discuss the development of categorization, noting that a rudimentary form of it appears in early infancy. They make the point that adults can acquire exceedingly abstract categories, while infants and young children have not been shown to have the same ability. Since it is well understood that experience influences not just our development, but affects responses in an immediate way, we can surmise that from birth our experience shapes the way that we perceive the world. Okay? So, what I mean by this, of course, is that from the moment you are born, that highest order category is created. All right. Or even, memories that you have before you were born, whatever it is, whatever your first memory is, doesn't matter. Whatever your first experience that you have, which technically is in the womb, okay, generates this highest order category. That first experience creates this highest order category. Every single experience that you have afterwards creates lower order categories that reinforce the highest order category. Okay. So this all of this is doing is me saying that the older that you get, the more abstract it gets because it's a system that is constantly reinforcing itself and it becomes more complex on its own naturally. Okay, so that's what I mean by this. And of course, again, this is supported by this idea. Now, of course, there is a little bit of a correlation that is being drawn here. There's a little bit of an abstraction of this idea because you don't just say like, oh, you get categories in early infancy and then adults acquire abstract categories. So that means that it's a generative feedback loop, right? Well, no, of course not. There's a larger logic that is going behind this. And I'm going to continue to explain it. But this is the general idea that I'm referring to when I say this. Okay. All right. So, yeah, this is why I take the moment to clarify that experience affects our development in an immediate manner. Okay. So it happens almost immediately where whatever experience that we are having shapes our perception, shapes our cognition, shapes our development. Okay. So this suggests that a feedback loop is created where experience shapes perception, which shapes the highest order category that then affects our behavior and creates new experiences. This process solidifies the existing perceptual filter, which was created from the moment of birth or whenever your first memory or experience was, a loop where your perception actively changes how you experience the world. Okay? So, in your all this means is exactly actually this part is relatively simple. I don't even think I need to explain this. Okay? I think this is good enough given all of the information that I have already explained. I think the rest of this is actually going to be pretty simple to understand. Okay? So um San et al. Discovered that prior information was incorporated into motor outputs from sensory inputs. They also note that the main question is the scale at which this process occurs. Okay, so all this means is like, okay, if you have like a pen, okay, and you're like stabbing yourself with a pen, eventually, or someone else is stabbing you with a pen, eventually you're gonna be like, yo, stop stabbing me with a pen, and you're gonna start moving your hand, and then you move your hand, but then they follow your hand and they start, then you keep trying to move your hand, right, and then so now every time someone holds a pen up to your hand, you're like, ugh, and you move your hand, right? So that's kind of what this is. That's what this study is kind of referencing. If I had to simplify the idea. Okay, the idea is just that how you control your body, okay, is determined by prior information that you processed. Okay, and so they note that the main question is the scale at which this process occurs, right? So I can actually answer this question under the universal perceptual filter under construction of reality. Okay, so it is actually a process which stacks upon itself, which suggests, again, a generative feedback loop that reinforces itself with any additional stimuli, which implies the scale spreads to every single stimulus that gets processed as well as any generated thought resulting from this processing. Okay? Which means it's literally infinite. Okay? It is infinite because we understand in the field of psychology that there are not many there isn't like a capacity. There isn't a capacity for our memory. There isn't a capacity for our experiencing, right? There's theoretically it is infinite. Okay, as far as we know, as far as we understand, right? There's no limit to how much information that we can process and how much information that we can learn, right? So that this again, this implies that it would be infinite in the same way that our memory capacity is. So this generative feedback loop is constantly stacking upon itself. So the scale at which your any prior information affects the way that you interact with the world is infinite and it is omnipresent. Okay, that would be the best way to put it, I imagine, because again, this is all resulting from a single highest order category, the universal perceptual filter. Okay, so this idea is further supported by Akrami et al. Okay, who came to the same conclusion through testing with monkeys and posit that the posterior parietal cortex is the critical locus for the process. While the exact method remains unknown, experience modifies processing in multiple areas of the brain through multiple senses, seen in the posterior parietal cortex and in the frontal cortex. Okay? So, in both of these papers, they found the same thing, basically, that prior information affected the way that we interacted and dealt with the world. Okay? And so, again, the universal perceptual filter, construction of reality, explains exactly how this works, and the way that it is explained is aligned with existing research. Okay, so this leads to the conclusion that experience is adapted to the existing perceptual filter, leading to inaccurate conclusions and decreased decision making ability, which is further supported by Akrami et al., who discovered through the silencing of the posterior parietal cortex that the reduction of experiential bias increased performance in their study. So when you lack bias, you perform better. Okay, wow, shocker, right? Based on the understanding that experience has a long term effect on development, we can deduce that regardless of the exact neuronal pathway, because there is very clearly some debate on how this neuronal pathway works or where exactly it is, right? Or how it relates to different things, right? It's going to, if you're talking about decision making, it's probably more in the frontal cortex. If you're talking about movement, it's probably going to be related more to the parietal cortex, of course, right? So that's like that's kind of where it is, right? Where the idea is. So regardless of the exact neuronal pathway, it is a process that is actively repeated with any experience, right? And so actually the fact that this occurs in multiple areas of the brain supports that this is a single highest order category that is filtering all of this information. Okay, so it again supports the idea that the perceptual filter does not simply receive input but repeatedly reinforces its own structure over time. Okay, and this idea is super important to hammer home because it's not just like everything gets filtered and then it's like a bunch of junk that doesn't matter. No, it's constantly reinforcing itself. It constantly comes down, the information comes through, okay, then it comes back around and reinforces the structure every single time. Okay, and this is why it's so hard. This is where we get into like crystallization, and this is I'm also going to go do research into crystallization and write a paper on that as well, right? So this is where crystallization, information processing comes in, where all of these things they kind of they add upon themselves, right? And so in that sense, uh, the more that you reinforce, well, okay, well, I won't go there. I'm going to do research first into crystallization and information processing, and then we can get there. But the point here right now is just that it repeatedly reinforces its own structure, and this is likely connected to crystallization on a on the level of consciousness. Okay. The application of categorization reveals further evidence that a universal perceptual filter is the primary driver of development and categorization. Categorization would then be a dynamic system. It is repeatedly reinforcing its structure through experience and the processing of information. Rather than fixed categories unique across all humans, it exists solely through the method by which the individual arrives at a categorical conclusion. Okay, so what exactly do I mean by this? All I mean is that there aren't like there aren't any fixed categories that you can determine for humans. It's not just like, oh, if your dog dies, you will be sad. Okay, it's never going to happen. There's always going to be an outlier. There's always going to be a crazy person that's like, nah, actually, like, I don't really care if my dog dies, or like, I don't know, something like that. You get it. That's a pretty good example, honestly, right? So it's only the method by which the individual arrives at a categorical conclusion. So this whatever hypothesis generation system that the individual has that was created by their experiences in the first place is going to be how they conclude any information, how they interpret and arrive at a conclusion, no matter what it is. Okay? So this idea is supported through Dang and Slutsky, who acknowledge existing evidence that the method by which category is learned may be the structure by which the category is formed, as in the process of acquiring the structure is the defining feature of the category. Okay, so again, the way that you define the category is how you acquire the structure of it. So your perception, what you believe about it, is literally forming the category of information. And you do this infinitely in your brain. Okay? So to elaborate, the rules by which a category is generated would be dependent on the perception of the experience. That's exactly what I just said. Your perception creates the category, right? A universal perceptual filter addresses both what and why questions proposed by Dang and Slutsky, that categories continuously evolve by way of experience. Okay, so I think I'm unsure of what the actual question was. I haven't reviewed the papers in a little while. I mean, just as a quick side note, I wrote this back in July of last year, and currently we are in the end of March. We're going into April. Okay, so it's been a little while since I read the actual papers themselves. Um, but I but the point is though is that the categories are going to continuously evolve through your experiences, right? So in other words, categorization would be a natural byproduct of experience-based development. So categorization is naturally occurring, and this is why I say, developmental psychology and cognitive psychology are not actually separate. Okay? They shouldn't be separate. There's no reason for them to be separate because they are the same thing. You experience something, you generate a category, this category reinforces your development. Okay? That's all I'm saying here. If I had to put it really simply, okay? Keep in mind, I am still tired. I've been doing this, I don't even know. How long is this video right now? Yeah, okay. Well, I'm 27 minutes and 44 seconds in. Kind of crazy. All right, so I've kind of and I've been tired this whole time. All right, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters right now is explaining this to you. All right, pardon me. We're gonna lock in again. Okay, we're gonna lock in again. I imagine this is. It looks like this is gonna be about at an hour. No, we're almost done actually. Okay, um, maybe 45 minutes. Anyway, so categorization is going to be a natural byproduct of the experience-based development. So these findings suggest that categorization may exist as a hierarchical structure, with the singular perceptual filter at the top of this hierarchy. The universal perceptual filter, and I explained this already, so it's the same idea. I'm reinstating the idea. I'm reinforcing the idea. Now that I've proposed evidence to suggest this conclusion. Okay. So the universal perceptual filter is then simultaneously a processing system for stimuli. This is why I want to go into information processing, and the category which contains our conceived notions of ourselves and life. Okay, so this is our sense of self that I'm referring here to. Okay, so this goes into something completely different. Okay, I mean it is related to cognition. It is related to cognitive psychology, how we perceive ourselves and the world and life. Okay, but the reason that I reference this in the way that I do right here is because it is literally everything. It is your every single experience that you have ever had gets filtered through this one category. Okay? This one category, which is very, very subject to error, by the way. Okay? Just throwing that out there. You can make an infinite amount of errors from this category. So keep this in mind. Keep this in mind. So this is why I say this. It's such a grand scale because it literally includes everything. So since this highest order category is a subjective creation dependent on experience, functional distortions in cognition would be the most likely result. And this is that I just said it. What I just said is this sentence right here. So I said it before we read it. Bars. Write that down. Quote that shit. I don't know. Fuck. I'm still tired. These distortions are well documented through the silencing of the posterior parietal cortex, increasing accuracy in trials. Biases. Okay, so and this is, yeah, this is what I'm talking about here. In this study, when you silence the posterior parietal cortex, okay, pardon my stuttering, okay, um, it increases accuracy in the trials because there's no more biases. There's no more bias, right? In that sense, right? Because they were rating it through movement and it was with mice. But I mean, go read the study if you want to look into it. But yeah, so anyway, okay, we're moving on. We're just moving on, all right? So it increased, the point is that silencing it increased the accuracy in trials, right? Because so it reduced the biases to some extent, okay? So if applying that to humans using construction of reality, using the universal perceptual filter, we can logically determine that there are going to be a lot of errors in the way that we perceive the world, no matter what. It's kind of like, I don't know, if you were going to shoot a basketball, okay, I guess I don't know. Basketball is a pretty common example of these things, right? If you were going to shoot a basketball and like you stayed flat-footed the whole time, right? Because one time somebody yelled at you to keep your feet flat, and you were, they were stupid, but you didn't know that, so you believed them, and then every single time you go to shoot a basketball, you shoot it flat-footed, okay? And then somebody comes up to you and they're like, "Yo, you gotta stop doing that, man. You're gonna miss all your fucking shots. Like you gotta jump. You actually gotta jump. Like try jumping every once in a while. Don't just shoot flat-footed, okay?" And then you're like, "Damn, okay, all right, I'm gonna try." But then when you go to shoot, you literally can't jump, okay? But you silence the posterior parietal cortex, and then all of a sudden it's just like, "Oh wow, I'm gonna jump now." Okay, right? Because before you had mapped that experience to your posterior parietal cortex, and I not exactly. All right, okay. Neurology is going to be another thing. We're gonna look more into neurology as well. All right, that's what we're gonna do anyway. So biases and prioritization with long-term implications. Anyway, yeah. So this is what I'm explaining right now. So it's fine. And how immediate experiences skew current perception, right? So the universal perceptual filter accounts for individual variability in trials and can potentially predict perceptual inaccuracies, right? Um, and I've actually done this before. I actually did this on my YouTube channel, on this YouTube channel, um, which is kind of crazy. I privated the videos because it was a little too much, and you're gonna see why in a second because I'm gonna explain it. Um, but I predicted an entire conversation between Dr. K and Jason Lewini. I predicted the entire conversation in the first 5 minutes. I predicted the exact loops that Jason Lewin was going to go through that entire conversation. I predicted what Dr. K was going to think and what he was going to say and what he was going to do. And I recorded it and I published it and I put it on the internet. Now, this obviously is going to be a problem because uh, it's a personal information. It is personal information that I was putting out there that I was analyzing, and I realized that that was a little too much. Okay, but I use construction of reality to determine these things, to make these predictions, and they are very accurate. Okay, so that's the point. That's the point of me saying that. So this is why I say potentially predict perceptual inaccuracies. Okay. And I've also created some personality types based off of cognitive distortions. But again, I need to do more research beyond just this. So, I have ideas, but I need to actually prove the ideas through research, of course, because that's how it works, and allow them to be peer reviewed and yeah, I think you get the point. All right. So this is why I say I've had a lot of success predicting perceptual inaccuracies, predicting cognitive distortions using construction of reality. So this is why I say this. Okay. So I'm not just saying this. This isn't just me like throwing fluff in there. I genuinely can do this. I have done this before, and I've shown that I can do this before. Okay. So this is why I put this in there. Therefore, the interpretation of categorization as being sourced from a perceptual filter integrates experience-based development and provides a framework for understanding cognitive biases and perceptual errors. Okay? So basically all I'm saying here is if if we follow the logical progression of everything that I've said so far, okay, this interpretation of a universal perceptual filter and of construction of reality, integrating and unifying these two fields, would actually explain cognitive biases and perceptual errors, and explain variability in trials, and explain numerous other things, and unify a bunch of other different fields of psychology. So, the establishment of the universal perceptual filter may have further implications in cognitive science, developmental psychology, and clinical applications, one of which is understanding perceptual distortions, or cognitive distortions, how they come to be, and how they affect cognitive processes. Another being the measurement of variability in research, which would potentially be derived from these perceptual errors. This also has potential for therapeutic effects, where we can accurately predict the perceptual distortions that generate psychological complications. Okay, and again, the reason I'm not just saying this is fluff, this is literally what I these are the ideas that I've had and I'm hinting at. I'm hinting at them. I was just hinting at it. I was like, maybe they could do this, right? And I mean, this is generally how you perform research. You say like this kind of hints at this. These are what the implications are, right? And and so this is like these are all of the ideas that I've had and the uses that I've gotten out of them. Okay? So it also has potential for therapeutic effects, right? Yep, yep. So even further, this concept may be used to reframe ideas of perception, information processing, and unify fields of psychology beyond development and cognition, which is a point that I've made multiple times in this video. So it is important to note that there are many limitations and questions for further research, such as the potential neuronal pathway, which was what I brought up before, and said that I needed to do more research in, the boundary between individual and societal effects. So what I mean by that is that this is a hyper individualized theoretical framework. So this is very focused on the individual. So understanding what it is suggesting on an individual level and then applying that to society and sociology is going to be difficult in determining where that boundary is exactly, right? The boundary of perceptual error and finding ways to measure the concept experimentally, right? So that's another issue, actually figuring out how we can experiment to figure out the boundaries of this theory, right? And with further research, these points may be elucidated, expanding the concept into verifiable understanding. Despite the limitations, the implications spread far and wide across many fields of psychology. Further work would include discovery of the neurological processes that the filter moves through, identifying personality types based on cognitive distortions, and application to theories of consciousness, to existing theories of consciousness, of which I've actually included quite a few. And if you've if you are well researched, then I'm probably striking a chord with many of you in many different areas. Okay, a lot of people are going to say that this sounds like a lot of different things, and I've had this experience a million times before. I've talked about my theory on my TikTok and Instagram page, but I didn't actually show my paper for it, which is why I'm kind of doing this now. But typically, the responses that I would get would be like, "Oh, this sounds like this person. This sounds like this person. This sounds like this person," but it was always different. It was always different. And it's always different because there are a lot of different ideas that actually go into this. Because again, this unifies the psychological field. Okay, this is the whole point of this, is to unify psychology, the entire field of psychology, under in a single framework. That is the point. That is the point. Okay, that is the purpose. That is the goal. That is what I wanted to do when I initially started creating this idea. Okay, well, actually, it wasn't. There was some. Okay, that's a different story. That's a story for another day. Okay, so the universal perceptual filter offers a unique and fresh perspective to existing psychological knowledge. The idea that a single perceptual filter exists at the core of our development and cognition in a generative feedback loop which strengthens the existing structure has the potential to adequately resolve many of the complications within fields of developmental and cognitive psychology, as I have just done here. Because under this theoretical framework, I was able to answer these questions rather simply. Okay? And again, this is theoretical in nature, but anyway, I think you get the point. Okay, so while also containing the possibility of resolving complications in other fields and in modalities of consciousness. This generative highest order category of perception is consistent with existing research and successfully, albeit theoretically, unifies knowledge across fields in theory. The universal perceptual filter could potentially shape not just how psychology defines cognition, but how the relationship between perception and reality is approached. Okay? So there we go. That is it. That is it. We made it. It's 40 minutes long to go over this. And I hope you enjoyed. This is very, very important to me. I've been working on this for many years now. I dropped out of school to continue working on this. I know it sounds crazy, right? That's another story though. Um, but I have done a lot of research into this, in case you couldn't tell. And this is very near and dear to my heart, which is also why I was so hesitant to share it in the way that I just did. But I figured, fuck it. So here we are. And also, I'm still going to be uploading anime videos and other stuff as well. So I'm just going to do whatever I want. Anyway, that's it. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. And wow, I did all of that in a single take. Can you believe that? I did all of that in a single take. I just recorded this entire thing. I mean, I guess that's not too hard to believe. I was stuttering like a motherfucker throughout some of that, huh? That was pretty funny. That was pretty fun. All right, I'm ending the video now. Bye. Get out of here.